Hello, Atmore. It's the Lloyd and Friends Show. And now here's your host, Lloyd Alderton.
Hello, Atmore. This is Lloyd Albriton right here at WGYJ. That's hard to say. And this is Lloyd and Friends Show. Interesting conversations with interesting people. Now, this is my first recording on this. We did this a few years ago on the other radio station here, and we haven't done it for a few years. So we're getting warmed up on the format here again. And so this is my first interview of this series. Mr. Ed Hudson. Some of you may know Ed. Ed, you want to say hello? Go ahead.
Well, hey, it's a privilege to be here among all the Albriton brothers. This is great.
This ain't all of them. This is
Well,
most.
not all,
Most.
all of the ones that are here, though.
Right.
Yeah.
I've got, you heard Brother Ronnie. Daddy it was 5 of us boys, and Daddy called us by number 1. He was kind of like Charlie Chan. You remember Charlie Chan? Number 1 son, number 2. He had
Didn't
like
have
20
spray paint
kids.
back then, or he just spray painted us. You know.
Yeah, he had us labeled as number 1, number 2, and Philip is number 3. My brother Philip back here behind me, he's our technician to make sure we don't get too many gaffes. Make sure Ronnie don't use no ugly words or anything.
I don't know any.
Right, this is a family show. It's a family show, Ronnie. All right, so we've known Ed a long time. Ed was, he is an interesting character, and I know that he is an interesting character because he wrote a book about some interesting events in his life, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But Ed just asked me when he arrived a few minutes ago, well, what's this going to be about? And I said, it's going to be about you. So think of all your interesting things you've done. I know as a law enforcement officer, you've had some. And, of course, we've got Ronnie here to agitate and inspire.
Stir the pot, so to speak.
Because these guys had a lot of experiences together. So, Ed, why don't we just start out? Just tell me a little bit about, now, we got some, I don't know if we're kin to Ed or not. Are we any relation to him? You know, BW and Dickie Hudson
Yeah, I
from
know who
Century.
you're talking about. I really don't know.
No, I don't.
You're not related to them, are you?
You know, I talked to Dickie back in the day, and
Yeah.
we never were able to make a connection where we were related, but,
Okay.
but more than likely we would probably.
Well, they stemmed
further
from
down the line.
their mother was an Albriton. What you're talking about, I think.
I was trying to think last night just how they fit in, but I know that Dickie and BW were my father's first cousin.
Yeah.
They were first cousins there, so they're fairly close. But I was just wondering, I never thought about it before, if maybe you were related to them, but I guess not.
Well, let me start with a disclaimer.
Okay.
I'm really not that interesting. I have been around some interesting people, and we can talk about that, but I've never claimed to be that interesting. But Ronnie and I worked a lot of years together, and we have worked with some characters.
Well, you know, Ronnie's heard this. I always find an opportunity to slip this in. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. You know what that is? There was this guy named Clarence something back in the 80s. He robbed a bank, and they got him on camera, and they went out and forthrightly and forthwith and picked him up. So they were interrogating him in the interrogation room, and they said, well, that was pretty stupid. You know, you went in there without a mask or anything, and you got your picture right here. We can see you did it. He said, I don't understand. He said, what about the juice? They said, the juice? Yeah, the lemon juice. He had read where George Washington used to use lemon juice for invisible ink. And they would heat the paper and the ink would come out. That's where they did it back in the day. And he had read that, and he thought if he put lemon juice on his face, that the cameras wouldn't be able to take a picture of him. And so they printed a news story about this, and these 2 guys from one of the big universities read the story, and they said nobody could be that dumb. So they decided to do some experiments in, in their college classes. Some colleagues, some junior students, and so forth. They did a whole study and giving tests and so forth. And what they came up with is this theory that, let's see, what's the word? It wasn't interesting. It's people always rate themselves higher than they are. People who are incompetent usually rate themselves as above normal incompetence. and this goes on to other things. People who are, Ronnie, we know Mr. Jake Hollingsworth and the old country guy. No matter how rich he was, he played poor. Right? He always did that, right? In the same way with interesting people, I personally never met anybody who wasn't interesting, but we all tend to look at ourselves and think we're not interesting. So we're gonna correct you on that. You're gonna be interesting. You're here. Yeah.
I'll try to play the part there.
Play the role. Now, Ed, tell us, take over the mic here and just tell us a little bit, give us some fundamentals about where you grew up and how you came to be a sheriff.
Well, I grew up in Oak Grove, which is right down there next to Walnut Hill, and I went to school at Ernest Ward High School. Well, I went through first grade through 12th grade at Ernest Ward High School, back when you could do that.
What year did you graduate?
I graduated in 1976.
Okay.
So then I left there and went to, well, I grew up working on a farm. There was a family there that lived close to us named the Snyders, and I worked on their farm most every summer. Billy and I that was the man's son, Marvin Snyder's son. Billy
Mennonite?
was Mennonite.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And we did everything together. In the summertime, I grew up working on the farm. We were kind of like brothers. And but then I went off to school, and he continued to farm, and just kind of separated paths there for a while. But I went to PJC, and then UWF, and started with my very first job in police with the Century Police Department.
I remember that.
Now now they don't exist anymore, but that's not my fault. It's not because of me. But I worked there for a year, and then I was hired into my dream job, the one that I wanted the most, and I got to work in the place that I wanted to work the most, which is the north end of the county. I went to work for the Escambia County Sheriff's Office. And
what year was that?
That was in 1981, was when I went to work at the sheriff's office. But worked there. I can still remember the first day that I went in. I got sworn in by the sheriff. He told me to go see Captain Norman Seeley.
Who was the sheriff back then?
Vince Seeley. And,
Vince Seeley? Okay, I remember
Vince Seeley. And he told me to go see Captain Norman Silcox. And Norman Silcox was kind of a big, rough fella. I mean, he could grab your hand when he shook it and put you on your knees. Anybody that I know of, he could do that to. But anyway, he looked at me real stern, and he said, "Your number is 204. Now go out to the garage, tell them to give you a car, and you report to the north end, Lieutenant Milstead." So I did that. Well, they didn't have a uniform to fit me, so I was wearing a suit. And I arrived in Century in my patrol car, which was already wore out. And I walk in the door, and there's Willie Ray Thomas, and he looks at me, and he said, "Ed, where's your uniform?" I said, "They didn't have one for me." He said, "Well, that won't never work." So he gets on the phone, starts calling around, finds out Coy Campbell and myself are about the same size, so I get a uniform from Coy. So the next week, I worked with Willie Ray Thomas as he was my training officer. I had a 1-week training period, and I hadn't been the same since.
That's understandable.
Yes. You probably have a few Willie Ray stories.
Yeah.
He was a great guy. But anyway, I worked there in the Century office for 9 years, transferred to narcotics, worked narcotics for 3 years, and then I got hired by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. I hired in as a special agent. I was a special agent for like 10 years, and then I was promoted to special agent supervisor for 11 years, and then I retired.
So you didn't retire from the sheriff, you retired from the state.
I retired from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
Okay, I didn't know that.
But that's cumulative time in service.
Yeah, all of that time went together.
Cumulative service.
Okay.
The sheriff's office was under the state retirement system. Yeah.
Okay. Ronnie, how did you run into Ed? What do you?
Well, in 1979, I was transferred from Pensacola proper, and they sent me to be assigned to replace Lonnie Lashley, who had been up there since the beginning of time, recorded time, just about. And he was showed up in that area. I was working there in Coy Campbell, I think, and I'm trying to think some other officers in charge there. When Vince was there was someone else too. I'm trying to think of his name.
Might have been Durwood Willis.
Durwood Willis. He had them two boys on the sheriff's department, Ronnie and Gary. But Durwood was up there a lot, and he was another hombre, kind of like Norman Silcox of that era.
Yeah, right.
But if they grabbed you, it was like, is he fixing to arrest me or what, or hug me?
Oh, they said his backhand you would never get up.
Oh, yeah.
It was that.
But I come, the way one thing I remember a story about, with the highway patrol in Florida went to the little Mustang patrol car.
Yeah, I remember when you drove
early and mid 80s. And I can remember the first day I showed back up after I'd been in Tallahassee and got one of those little go-karts. And everybody in Century, when you drove by, they turned, almost ran into a sign when they saw the car. But I remember taking you for the test ride in it, remember?
Oh, yes.
Yes,
I remember that. Yeah.
Took him out Highway 4 over to Jay.
Yes.
And, of course, the thing was short, and it felt every blade of grass you ran over, like bump, 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 bump. I mean, it was quick. And I can remember Ed's comment after I took a word. He's hanging on by the strap, and we're trying to talk to one another. He says, let me ask you, he said, you think this little old car's going to hold up? You remember that? I said, yeah, if it breaks, we'll just get another one.
Yeah.
But they were just suited for traffic enforcement. You could maneuver quickly and turn around. You didn't have to think about it. I had to learn how to drive again after 11 years of those Mustangs, and they gave me another big car. And you literally couldn't make that.
You drove those big old Plymouths before that, didn't you?
Oh, yeah,
or
those 440 Plymouths and land yachts, No, couldn't build brakes big enough to stop the thing.
Well, Ronnie, back in the day of when J.D. Rigby was the deputy down here, I think he was the only one in the area.
Phillips.
J.D. Phillips, too,
Phillips
yeah. And they always had big hot cars. They had the big engine because you had to run them down.
Oh, yeah.
And you had these old redneck boys back in those days who always run. They couldn't call a roadblock. There's nobody to block it,
Right.
They just had to run them down. So the sheriffs were known for having hot cars. And of course, all the boys had hot cars, too, so it was quite a...
Well, I think back in those days, they let you go buy your car and you leased the car to the county.
Oh, is that what they did?
Is the way that went. So they would go buy the hot car.
Oh, I see.
You mentioned J.D. He kept a short-barreled shotgun right under his feet there at the front seat. And he would just kick it back in place when it would slide out. Well, one time he kicked it and it went off.
Oh, Lord.
Blew a hole in the door.
Well, those kind of things happen. When we transitioned on the highway patrol to the semi-automatic pistol in the late 80s, went from the revolver, which we'd all carried, and a lot of the guys, we had to go for 2 weeks in Tallahassee and shoot day and night, and just thousands of rounds through that Beretta. And you always do the manual of arms. You take the magazine out and you take it out. And, well, one rainy day, and Charlie Smith was a trooper I worked with in Milton, and Charlie was thinking about that practice we'd been doing, and he was thinking it in his mind, but he was listening to his radio too, so he leaned over and he chambered him around, and then he took that magazine out and then he snapped it like you're supposed to. Well, he had that backwards. So he chambered another one and then took it out. You take it out and then chamber it, and it's empty. And he shot a hole over there in his sidewall of his car. Just, you take it out, clear it, and then bam, clear it, and the thing went off. And
Well,
he said, I like to die when that happened.
So you're supposed to take the magazine out first.
Yeah, because when
And
you
then-
chamber
and
it, you
then-
just
and
put
then empty the
another
round
one
out.
in when
Yeah.
you
Clear
take
it
one
out.
out. Yeah,
Right.
you got to know the
Right.
workings of it. That's what.
So he put it in and then took the magazine out. Well, that could happen.
But guns go off.
Sure they will,
They
yeah.
just do. I had a Llama 380 that I kept on my ankle, and the only safe way to carry a Llama 380 is locked and cocked.
I like the old 1911.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much the
Just
same.
like
And so I decided that wasn't safe. I was at the Atmore Police Department one night, and one of the investigators there, he looked at it and he had to have that gun. He really wanted it. He told me he had a Chief Special Smith & Wesson revolver that he would trade me even for, and I was thinking, well, that's exactly what I need.
Mm-hmm.
So we traded. The next night, I'm getting ready for work, go out early to meet an informant. I check the gun out, look at it, and empty it out, dry fire it, load it back up. And then as I'm beginning to put it back in my ankle,
I remember that day.
yes, I remember it well. It went off and shattered the bone below my knee.
Really? That was the Smith & Wesson?
Yes, 38 plus P. That's a very strong round. These movies you see where they get shot and they keep going, that don't happen.
I've often wondered. I've never been shot, but
So I know some of the people out there listening to this is going to already know that story, so I thought I'd go ahead and get that out of the way.
Before they called in already.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. Accidents happen. It's human. You get your mind going 3 or 4 different ways. And a firearm of any kind, the assumption as you train all the years is it's always loaded. No matter if I unload my gun and hand it to you, you go through the same unloading practice.
Yes.
And it's because of things just like that can happen. You
well,
don't
you
ever
know,
assume.
the last year that I was in Vietnam, it was in '73, and we lost more Marines from shooting themselves than we did from the enemy.
Oh, really?
You got a bunch of 18, 19-year-old boys carrying loaded guns around all the time. It'd be one. I remember one incident to where some guys in the back of a truck, and the gun was leaned up, and it fell over and shot the driver in the back of the head. And cleaning your weapons in the barracks,
Yeah.
shoot somebody. But
Well, you can't take it lightly or forget about it. You have to focus.
Well, now that we're on this subject, Ed and Ronnie being police officers, what's your feelings about gun control?
Side alignment, trigger squeeze.
No, I mean, where we're going with we don't have to go into any great detail, but I hear that law enforcement officers generally are for gun control. In other words, they don't want citizens to have them, but they always have theirs.
I've never been that way. In fact, you probably have, Ed. I've stopped people and taken a gun from them while I'm questioning them, and he's the guy's looking out for himself. And I've actually given it back to him. In fact, one of y'all, I think Carl or somebody, hauled one to jail for a violation of something. I think it's child support. Had warrants on him. Come down. I said, you ain't taking my gun. I said, no, I'm not going to take it. I'm going to give it back to you, man. He's going to take it while he's transporting you to jail, but I'm not charging you with it. Everybody should have a gun, and you should have it loaded, and you should have it taken care of and cleaned. I wrote a paper to that effect when I was going to college. Of course, I was a minority. And this was a hippie era, and they could tell I was police or a pilot because I wore my shiny shoes. And they look at them shoes. This guy's got to be an aircraft pilot or a police officer. Well, I was a minority, but I wrote that as a joke, really, but it's sincere. I think if everyone did that and I stopped them for a headlight out, let me see your pistol. If it's not clean, here's a correction card. Get a tail light fixed and clean your pistol, Everybody then after that, boy, they just kind of, wait a minute.
Well, I'm not real fond of people who have demonstrated their inability to obey the law in having guns. If you're a convicted felon, you've kind of shot that.
That's right.
Well, some states, New York, for example, are very anti-gun control.
Oh, yeah.
I see all these new movies made in New York where the guy gets a intruder in the house and he goes down to his office and he unlocks the safe and he finds his bullets and he's loading his gun. I just can't see that happening. I mean, you're going to be so flustered. I mean,
right.
If you don't have that gun loaded and by your bed, what good's it going to do you?
That's right.
Right.
Well, talking about that, Lloyd, back in 1968, you may remember, 1968 was this gun thing and a war was going on. But Ted Kennedy was the big proponent then of just abolishing them. Mm-hmm. It was the Gun Control Act of 1968.
Okay.
I don't know if you ever read anything about that, but that's where all that kind of stuff kicked off with Ted Kennedy.
Yeah.
And
Well-
they didn't want anybody to have guns. They wanted to have their own and guards to
Right.
protect them, but they didn't want you to have one.
Right.
And it's also kind of strange that these people, well, not all of them, but some of these people who want so much gun control are the very ones demonstrating the need for it.
Yeah, that's
You know,
right.
and not for gun control, but for against gun control. You know,
Uh-huh.
because of the way they behave. They have no regard for property or people.
That's
So,
right. Yeah, well, based on that, what you're talking about is it only takes a few to ruin it for everybody.
That's true.
And they'll mess it up, and things go to changing, and then they start going the wrong way. The changes.
Now, Ed, I know we want to talk about your book that you wrote, and I know you've been on the stump out and doing signings and so forth. First of all, how do you like the writing thing? Tell us about the difficulty of writing that book. How long of a book is it?
It's not a long book. It's I don't even remember how many pages it is, but it's a relatively quick read. It's an easy read. It's the life story of a guy named Freddie Crow who grew up in Century, Florida. And it's not the book that I would have chose to have written, but circumstances led me to do it. Freddie was a marijuana trafficker and would fly in loads of marijuana. In the end, he was flying in from Belize, Central America, working along with a guy named Billy Deacle. Now, Freddie was an interesting character, and Billy was just as interesting as well. We'll talk more about Freddie, but just to tell you a little bit about Billy. Billy grew up in a law enforcement family, but all he knew how to do was smuggle. He'd been in and out of prison a few times, but his great-grandfather was a judge. His grandfather was a sheriff. His father was I think a major with the Florida Department of Corrections. His sister worked for the Florida Department of Corrections. His mother was a school teacher, and Billy was a drug smuggler. So
Takes all kinds.
he went his own way. And he also had a brother. His brother is a guy named...
We need to get him on the program.
And he also has a brother. His brother is a guy named George R. Deacle Sr., and he was the last prosecutor for Ted Bundy.
Oh, wow.
A little history there.
So it's... Billy comes with his own set of circumstances, but Freddie grew up in Century, a rambunctious kid, just always getting into things. He had an older sister that pretty much raised him because his father was Fred Crow, who owned Crow's Bar. They also owned a store and a bar over in what they called the Quarters, where the black community was in Century. But Freddie's mother, Sybil Crow, and Fred were busy running the stores and the bars and stuff, so his older sister Bobby helped raise him. Bobby was she is just a fantastic lady. She made sure that Freddie went to church, tried to raise him as good as she could. Freddie was just bound and determined to go his own way. He also had a sister named Tricia as well. But Freddie learned to love airplanes early in life, and from that he obtained his pilot's license, I think, by the time he was 16 years old, if I'm not mistaken.
So intelligent too.
He was. He didn't do well in school.
Mm-hmm.
School wasn't exciting enough for him.
Yeah.
He was kind of running on adrenaline, but he loved to fly, and he started crop dusting right away. So if you know anything about crop dusting, you know it takes quite the daredevil to be able to successfully crop dust, and Freddie was very good at it. Along the way, he learned that he liked marijuana. So he kind of combined all that together and funneled it into a smuggling career.
How long did that career go on? I mean, how old was he when he started it?
I want to say he was 25 at his first arrest. So he was born in '49. But his first arrest was actually with a car. He had worked out a deal with a friend of his that lived down in the valley in Texas, and he supplied him with the car and the marijuana, and Freddie got caught with it. So he went to get him an attorney, and he picked the very first one he talks to, and it was only 250 pounds, and it was in Texas, and he wound up with a 4.5 year sentence, federal sentence, which tells me he didn't have a very good attorney, because that was kind of common back then, and they wasn't sticking all of them in prison. But anyway, he went to prison, and he gets out, and he makes some more connections, and he gets back in prison, and he's back and forth, and the last time he goes, the second time before the last, he meets Billy Deacle in prison, and that's where they bond their enterprise and start smuggling from Belize. There are a number of people mentioned in the book, and
who had the connection in Belize? Billy or?
Well, actually, it was Billy that had the connection. So Freddie was just going to be a part of it, and to begin with, that's all he was just a pilot. They paid him just for pilots fee for flying in loads. Now, the thing about flying in loads from Belize is you had to know how to get back in the country. It's not hard to leave the country. You get up in there and just take off and go. But when you come back in, if you're carrying a load of marijuana, you better be able to blend in. In order to do that, he would fly to the Yucatan and then cut over across the Gulf to a certain longitudinal point, head straight north, and he would come in around the Big Bend of Florida. Now, he was about 200 miles out before he hit land. He would get down so low over the water that the salt from the sea spray from the waves would start collecting on the windshield and clouding the windshield. And he's flying that low over the Gulf of Mexico.
He's below the radar.
To get below the radar.
Okay.
That's it. Now, you get to thinking now when you're spraying crops, you got to get down real low on the crops too. But the crops are generally one height. The waves of the Gulf of Mexico are up and down and rolling, and also you don't spray in 200-mile stretches when you're crop dusting. So it takes quite a talent to do what he was able to do. Once he hit shore, he would go in just a little bit and then shoot straight up, get into the normal air height, and go to the interstate and fly to wherever it was he was going. Most of his loads went to around J. They did fly in some loads. Their very first load, I think, was in just out from Lake City, but they eventually wound up flying in most of their loads from J to J.
Now, I've always wondered about this. When you don't hang with that crowd, it's hard to believe that many people are smoking this stuff. Where are all they go to J? Who comes to J to get their drugs?
Well, they had distributors. They had their distributors.
Okay.
They did, and they came from North Carolina. They come from Troy, Alabama. and they would come in and get their part of the load.
Oh,
then
and
they would
distribute
go-
it
Then
out in
they
these-
would go out and distribute it their
Probably
location.
because Jay was a farming, remote community.
That-
They thought they
that's
were
it.
under the
It was-
radar there too, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And that worked for him for quite a while.
It worked. I think they started that in 85 or 86. And it worked until we arrested him in 1990. So,
Only a few years there. Okay.
but
Now, were you in on that bust?
well, on part of it. Billy had been indicted.
Did you know him coming up?
I did
or
not.
You didn't.
I-
Okay.
I
You
knew-
only met
I
him through
knew
this.
I knew of Freddie not long after I became a Century Police Department.
Okay.
A member of the Century Police Department. But no, I did not know him. I met him when his girlfriend shot him.
Okay.
But
That's when you were on Century PD.
That's when I was a narcotics officer.
Okay, with
at
the state,
Escambia
okay.
County.
Oh, with
Sheriff's
Escambia County,
office,
okay.
Sheriff's office, yes. Well, when I transferred to narcotics, I was asked to join into the investigation because I came from up there and I knew some of the players and how they moved around and all. There were a number of people, local people up there that were involved in the smuggling part of it. So not so much with getting rid of the marijuana, but with offloading and storing and that kind of stuff. But so Billy had been indicted for like 3 years before 1990. Freddie had also been indicted, but we just couldn't prove it was Freddie that had got indicted. That's an interesting thing too. When Freddie met Billy in prison, he told him, "I don't want to meet anybody and I don't want them to know who I am." Well, that's kind of hard to do if you're going to fly the airplane, but Freddie found a way. Before he started going out for the trip and all, he dressed in fatigues. He took camouflage paint and painted his face all up to where you could not, there was no
He was just
skin.
totally
There
camouflaged.
was no skin left visible.
Okay.
Then he had a scalpel knife on his side. So that very first load.
Well, at least he was conscientious about his profession, wasn't he?
Well,
Well, he wanted to do his very best.
Yeah, he did. Absolutely. And when that very first load, when he gets down out of the airplane, they're all looking at him like, who is this?
It's Che Guevara.
Che
Because
Guevara.
Billy's the only one that knows who it is, and he's not telling them. So they gave him the name Rambo.
Oh,
Yeah.
So as the case goes along and people began to get indicted on various things, people began to talk, and they told about Billy Deacle that's flying in loads of marijuana, and he's got this guy named Rambo. So the U.S. government indicted Rambo.
they indicted Rambo.
They indicted Rambo.
I bet you Sylvester Stallone was sweating it if he'd heard of it.
Probably, I'm sure. So anyway, I arrested Billy along with the narcotics squad behind Bennigan's. They're at University Mall, back when Bennigan's was at University Mall. I think it's a funeral home now, I believe, they're located there. But I located him and we arrested him, and from that trial they were able to determine that Freddie
Was Rambo.
because one of the guys finally coughed it up and said, well, yeah, that's Freddie Crow. So that's how Freddie got arrested. Freddie made a very conscious decision that night when he was arrested. He went straight to jail. Nobody talked to him. And he sat there in jail and he said, you know what? I think I'm going to be done with this. There ain't no telling how long I'm going to have to serve, but I'll just do what I got to do, and I'm going to be done with it. He never even talked to an attorney. The next morning, he asked to speak to DEA agent Charlie Gravatt. And Charlie was the lead agent on the case. And from then, he just began cooperating with law enforcement. And it was a very substantial cooperation. Do you know Randy Hensel?
Know that last name.
Randy was he was a state attorney prosecutor there at one time, and then he became the assistant U.S. attorney there in Pensacola, and he was the one prosecuting the case. And both Charlie Gravatt and Randy Hensel both told the judge at Freddie's sentencing that they had never had anybody cooperate to the amount that Freddie Crow had cooperated. And because of that, he went from a life sentence to a 10-year sentence. He got his sentence reduced.
But did he bring down some other guys?
Well, yes, the whole thing.
The whole thing, okay.
The whole thing went down, yes. Yeah, there were a number of people indicted in that case, yes. The main guy that was in Belize, I believe was indicted, but he had obtained citizenship in Belize, and they have a non-extradition clause with the United States on those kind of things, and so he never was arrested.
Well, it sound you almost make it sound. Excuse me for the coughing. You almost make it sound like Freddie Crow was a pretty nice guy.
Well, he was the kind of guy that on holidays, whenever he was flying down to pick up a load, he would go to Walmart and buy them out of T-shirts and put them in the plane and give them away. We did that all through the year, but on holidays he would buy frozen turkeys and frozen hams and load the plane down with that and take them down and just give them away.
So he genuinely was at heart a pretty nice guy.
He was.
But now this, what I'm getting at, this cabal that he was dealing with, generally, drug dealers are not real nice guys, are they?
Generally not.
So he was putting his life in some
and there was some
jeopardy.
Violence, but it wasn't necessarily associated with the organization, but some of the people in the organization had committed some violent crimes. But
what?
And when I arrested Billy, he had some stolen guns on him.
In that the drug business or business, we would say, in the drug business, is it like the mafia? I mean, they get you when you rat. Are you genuinely putting your life in danger?
I think that you have to look at each situation differently because they're not all that way. I don't think Freddie never was worried about anybody coming after him.
Okay.
He never worried about that. I know that there are some organizations that will take out people that cross them. I know that.
Well, it's a pretty big incentive, I assume, from the money.
Well, yes, and there was lots of money. Even with the deal with, I think Freddie and Billy were flying in loads like every other month, and he had so much money it became a problem because you couldn't take it to a bank. So he wound up burying it. He would put it in PVC pipe and bury it in different locations. Well, while he was away in prison for 10 years, we had 2 hurricanes in 1995, and it changed the terrain tremendously.
He couldn't find his money.
That was Aaron and Opal we had.
Yeah.
There's probably people digging all over that part of the
Well, that's always the comment from a lot of people that have interviewed me. I even talked to a guy in England, and he said, well, just go ahead and talk. I'm checking on flights to Century right now. But no, it was...
that kind of reminds me of a scene from Breaking Bad where the guy had his money in barrels out in the desert.
Right.
I don't know if you saw that show, but...
Yeah, I didn't watch it too much. But yeah, it is a problem because, You got to do something with it. And he felt like that was the safest thing to do. Now, the other problem was Freddie developed a pretty bad cocaine habit. And he was usually strung out on cocaine, and it doesn't help your memory any whenever you're
Trying to remember where your money is.
Strung out on cocaine, yeah. So there's another problem. But anyway, after he goes to prison that was in 1990. In 1993, I get hired by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and my very first case with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was Freddie's cocaine dealer, a guy named Buddy Brunson, over in Jay.
Yeah.
Well, Jay's a hopping place, isn't it?
Yeah.
Used to be a little sleepy farm community.
Right. Well, they had to
Oil came to town.
All came to town.
It came to town, then it left, and you had to do something to fill the gap. So,
I hear you.
but I brought Freddie back out of prison because I remembered in interviewing him and all that's one of the things he told me. So he testified in my very first case with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and I think that's when we began to develop a bond. We spent a good time in interviews, and then when the trial was over with, I had to take him back to Eglin Air Force Base where he was being housed, and we had a good long talk on the way back, and I talked to him about changing his life and the things that he needed to do, and he was very receptive. Matter of fact, when he went to get out of the car, he stuck his head back in the car and he says, "Do you mind if I call you from prison?" I said, "No, I'd be okay." So he shut the door, and I was thinking, well, he may or may not, but he did. He started calling, and he continued to call up until the time it was time for him to get out, and then he wanted to know if it's okay if he came to see me at work. And I told him, sure, come on by. Well, long story short, that ended up developing into him becoming an informant for me with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. It wasn't for any active case because, number one, personally, I didn't want to see him get back active in the game because that's a slippery slope for him to
What age was he? What age was he when he got out?
He was in his 50s, I guess.
He had spent quite a few years in prison by that time.
Yeah.
So he was institutionalized somewhat, would you say?
Well, he'd been in and out. I think the 10 years. Well, I know the 10-year stretch was the longest that he had done. So, to whatever extent 10 years would do to you.
Now, he's out now, though. Is he still living?
He's passed away.
He's passed away now. Okay.
He became an informant. He was interviewed by a number of agencies that were just wanting to know what he knew. The Department of Homeland Security came down and interviewed him because they had an interest in how he was so successful getting back into the country, so undetected. They felt like they had a hole in the radar coverage, and it's just the fact that he was so good he could fly under the radar. The curvature of the earth and all that presented that opening for him. So, but then in 2013, he was diagnosed with cancer, with liver cancer, and that's when our relationship changed. He was up until that point, it was cop informant kind of thing. But once he was diagnosed with cancer, I closed him out, and I made it a point to try to help him as he walked those last days on earth. He had met a wonderful woman named Sandra that it became his wife, and they had a wonderful life going. They bought a real nice house on Pine Barren Road, and he'd built a real nice pond, and everything was going great up until the diagnosis.
Now, what about all of his money? The money he didn't lose in the pipes. Was that confiscated, or did he have some of that?
No, most of that was
away?
spent. That you don't live the way they lived without needing a lot of money.
Lawyers and so forth.
Well, not even lawyers. Just their lifestyle that they lived. I mean, if they wanted to go somewhere, they took off and went. If they
sort of like Elvis,
they drop I don't know how much at topless bars. You know that it was that was one of the places they loved to frequent. Imagine that. But
shoot, that don't make a bit of sense. You know, that kind of money. You seen one, you seen them all. You know.
They would go through a great deal of money. It really did.
Just the lifestyle.
Just in their lifestyle. But after he'd gotten out and gotten through his probation, he was a truck driver for a little while, and then he bought a business where you refinish this concrete to make it look like anything you want it to look like, whether it's wood or brick or whatever.
Sounds kind of like what Don Gordon does out here in Atmore. I don't know if you're familiar with Don.
No, that's
pavers is what he makes.
That's what he did, and he had a real good business going. And Sandra was a wound nurse at a nursing facility, and so everything was going great. But I got a good glimpse of the good Freddie Crow. It was he was a person that would. He grew a great big garden, way more than he ever needed, and then he'd travel around giving it away to people. And it was if he'd help take care of neighbors that were down, and he loved to cook banana pudding and give those away. That was his special gift to everybody.
Well, Ed, I've read the book. And it was well written. It's one of those kind, and I'll do a lot of reading, that you just can't put it down, and when you do, you can't wait to pick it back up and read it again. That's how I enjoyed it from my viewpoint.
Yeah.
Lloyd's was the same way. I told him, I said, he has come out like that, and I read them, just eat them up, but I'm an avid reader.
Right.
And I enjoy it.
Yeah.
But,
well, talking about the writing of the book, how difficult was that? When I had written a lot of short stories through my life. I've always enjoyed writing and telling stories, newspaper editorials and so forth. And it was always easy for me to sit down and write, say, a 1,500-word editorial or a short story. I get to the end of it, I tweak it a little bit, and bam, I got my story. Mm-hmm. But when I decided to write a long novel, which my novel took from probably 1920s up to 1950s. I found myself on the third chapter. The guy was Joe, and by the time he got down to chapter 10, he was Jim. Yeah. You know, he was driving a blue Chevrolet here, and before I got through, he was driving a red Ford. Because I'm trying to adopt the things that I know in my head to fiction.
Yeah.
But somebody said, you got to make a timeline. And that's what I had to do. I had to make a timeline. It was very difficult. And I'd get to like 8 or 9 chapters, and I'd just run out of juice. Right. I just couldn't get it done. And a friend of mine said, Lloyd, you've got to write the last chapter. It's like teaching a class. You've got to know where you're going.
Right.
You know, it's like flying an airplane, talking about airplanes, from New York to Los Angeles. They don't fly in a straight line. They have to correct. And so when you do that, that helped me to complete mine. It's that when you get off track, you got to move back in line. But if you don't know where you're going, you're liable to end up anyway.
Yeah, it helps you see where
that was
you're
a very
going.
difficult thing for me to do.
I think mine was having to be convinced that I needed to do it. I wrote the first 3 chapters without too much trouble. Now, mine being a true story, I stuck strictly to facts. I got it from my own personal knowledge, from interviewing a lot of people, and from newspaper articles and court transcripts and reports, law enforcement reports.
Is this a first-person narrative, or how did you write? Were you in the book?
I am in the book, but I wrote it in third person, and I was questioned about that. Why would you do that? And because it seems like it would have been better if it was in first person. Well, to begin with, the family asked me to write this book the day of his memorial service. Freddie had started, he wanted to write a book, and he did research, and he collected all the court transcripts and everything, but he never got around to writing it. And they wanted the book, and they asked me to write it, and I couldn't turn them down. So I write these first 3 chapters, and then all of a sudden, I'd done what you talked about. I knew what each chapter wanted to be, what I wanted it to be, and but I didn't know how I wanted to say it. So there's a story in the book about 2 $20 bills. I had been over at Freddie's after he'd gotten down real low and wasn't able to stay out of bed too long at a time. And he had some things that needed to be done around the house. So the screen door fixed and blinds put up, and I trimmed his crepe myrtles for him. And when I get through, he meets me out at the truck, and we talk for just a little bit, and I could tell that he's all wore out still, even though he's just gotten out of bed. And so I go to pull off, and he says, "Look in your console." So I did. I opened up the console, and there's 2 $20 bills sitting in my console. Well, I didn't want that money. I wasn't there to make money. But I also knew that he wasn't in any shape to be arguing with. So I just shut the console lid, and I drove off knowing I wouldn't ever spend it on myself. Well, after he died, it just stayed there in my console, and every time I opened up, I thought about him. And so I was determined to try to find a use for it. And that's when Hurricane Michael hit. And I went over several times helping to do cleanups and stuff. And in one of my visits, I come across the First Baptist Church at Mexico Beach. And I talked with the pastor there, and he showed me what he was doing there. He had opened up all of his outside buildings, and it would become kind of like a makeshift Dollar General store, only he wasn't selling anything. It had clothing, cleaning items, just all kind of stuff. And people come in, get what they need, only what they need, and then they leave. Mm-hmm. And he was running it off of donations. Well, when I saw that and saw what he was doing, I said, it's not a lot, and it's probably not going to help a whole lot, but I think I know what the 2 $20 bills should do. So I gave it to him, and when I did, I told him the story about Freddie, and I think it was after that, and he prayed. We prayed together about it, and it was after that that block got lifted. I was convinced I had a story worth telling.
Is this a sad story, or is it a story? I think you used the word redemption. Is that what's the title of it?
It's As the Crow Flies: The Redemption of an International Drug Smuggler.
I knew I remember the word redemption being in there.
Yeah.
Is it what's the message? Is there are criminals smart in general, or are they pretty dumb?
Yeah.
I mean, most of them, a lot of them are in prison, so they couldn't have been that smart, right?
Yeah.
Well,
are most of them in prison?
I think there are exceptions that are smart.
I'm sure there are a lot of people that may even hear what we're talking about that just kind of chuckles. You have to know that. I mean, just think of the people that you work around. No matter how hard you work, trying to stomp out the fire, it'll flash up over here. It's always going on.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some that never get caught. But they get caught by our Lord and Savior. He catches them in the end.
Right.
If they got time to make their amends with Him, it's...
Yeah.
How many of them do get caught? I mean, how many We worry about letting all the convicts loose out of prison, that they're going to just inundate society with crime. But most of the criminals are probably still out, would you say? Already.
Yeah, well, yeah, probably so. Are
I don't know how much difference it would really make if we put a few more murderers out there.
We're still being plagued with crime, so yeah, there are a lot
They're
of criminals out. Yeah, but you ask how smart they are. It just depends on each one. Each one's different. I just heard about there was a smash and grab done down in Destin in the daytime. They're getting away with that in California.
Yeah,
as long as they stay under $1,000 and everything's fine. But
it's good to know in case I ever.
so this guy, they apparently they watched the news and saw what was going on in California. They tried it in Destin, and they get run down by the cops and thrown in jail. And I know they're wondering what in the world's going on.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. A lot of the immediate news about these things that happen just feeds the fire of those that ain't quick enough to understand the shortfall of that thing. You get yourself involved in that, you just it'll break it off on you. Naive is what it is.
Other than Freddie Crow, did you find a lot of criminals that you kind of liked during your career?
I found some
Maybe admired a little bit.
That I not that I'd say that I'd admire, but I some that I understood. But not a lot. There was too much that you could tell there was no lesson learned.
That's right.
It was, and
the end is probably not that great for most of them, in spite of all the money and the strip bars and all the fun that they've been having. In the end,
no,
there's nothing there, is there?
No, and it was one of the things about Freddie. Whenever I brought him back out of prison to testify in that first trial, excuse me, one of the first things he did was thank me. Because he's relatively certain he probably would have been dead by that time if we hadn't have arrested him.
That's right.
His cocaine use had gotten that bad, and what we don't catch, a lot of them destroy themselves anyway.
Ed Hudson, author, police officer, got a lot of experiences. I don't think we had any trouble filling an hour, did we, Ronnie?
Has it been an hour?
It's been an hour. We only get an hour, but maybe we could do this another time.
Yeah.
I was going to say we need to find Freddie and bring him in, but undoubtedly it's too late for that.
He's wrapped in the arms of Abraham now.
Well, I was hoping we'd hear so many times Ronnie would come into the office in the daytime and he'd be all wore out. He said, "I've been over in Santa Rosa County dispensing justice. we need to go get a cup of plasma."
Well, I wanted to have more funny stories, but we really, I think, did well covering that book. I wanted to cover that story. I knew you put a lot of work into it, and you still have the book on the market. Where can we buy it at?
It can be bought on Amazon, but there are also local stores. The Glam Shack here in Atmore on Main Street. JR's Barbershop in Walnut Hill has them for sale.
Okay.
The Cantonment Mercantile, which is right down there at the Cantonment Feed store, where they have the ice cream. You can go in there and get some fantastic ice cream.
Okay.
And buy a book while you're at it. There's a place over in Flomaton that Raybo's ice cream.
Just across the overpass.
Just across the overpass in Flomaton.
Okay.
And then CP Rivers Furniture Store in Milton carries them. And then there's also a fish camp, Shell Island Fish Camp in St. Mark's, Florida.
Okay. And the name of the book one more time.
As the Crow Flies, The Redemption of an International Drug Smuggler.
Okay. Sounded like a great story.
It is a good book. Very well.
We want you all to go out and give it a try. Ed, thanks so much for coming in. We're doing this, by the way, we're trying to accomplish a conversational atmosphere, and we're doing this in here, crowded around in my little office with a computer, and hopefully it'll come out. Thank you, Ed. Thanks, Ronnie.
Thank you.
And my other brother, Philip. Philip, thank you.
You're welcome.
And God bless. And this is Lloyd Albritton, Lloyd and Friends. Interesting conversations with interesting people.
Thanks for listening to the Lloyd and Friends Show with Lloyd Albritton.